The ground crew found the piece 3 hours after the landing. It was wedged behind the firewall of the number 1 engine nacelle, jammed in so hard they had to work it loose with a pry bar and a length of 2x4, about the size of a dinner plate, scorched aluminum, torn along one edge, and on the flat side, still legible under the soot, a smear of dark green paint and the curve of something red. It was part of the engine cowling of a Nakajima Ki-44, a Japanese fighter, and it was inside an American bomber that had just landed on Saipan. The crew chief carried it over to the hard stand where the wreck was sitting, one wing in the dirt, and he set it down on the concrete and just looked at it for a while. Because the thing about that piece of metal is that it could not get where it was found by accident. A bullet does not put a fighter's cowling inside a B-29's engine bay. Flak does not do that. There is exactly one way that happens, and every man standing on that hard stand knew what it was. Somebody had flown into them, on purpose, and according to the 11 men who had climbed out of that airplane, somebody had done it twice. This is the story of a bomber that was never supposed to come home, a gunner who ran out of ammunition 800 miles from the nearest friendly runway, and one of the most disputed victory claims of the Pacific Air War. Some of it is on the record. Some of it was argued about for decades. All of it starts on an island most Americans had never heard of 2 years earlier. Saipan, January 1945. To understand what happened in the sky over Tokyo that morning, you have to understand how bad things had already gotten for the men flying out of Isley Field. The B-29 Superfortress was supposed to be the answer. Pressurized cabin. Remote-controlled turrets aimed by a computer. 4 engines hauling it above the flak, above the fighters, above everything. It cost $600,000 a copy when a P-51 cost $50, and it was the most expensive weapons program of the war, more expensive than the atomic bomb. And by late January 1945, it was not working. The 73rd Bombardment Wing had been flying from Saipan since the end of November. 4 bomb groups on an airfield that had been a Japanese strip 6 months earlier and still had wrecked Zeros bulldozed into the scrub at the edges. The targets were aircraft factories, Musashino, Mitsubishi at Nagoya. Daylight precision bombing from high altitude, the same doctrine the 8th Air Force used over Germany, and on paper it should have worked. Then they found the jet stream. Nobody had planned for it because nobody really knew it was there. At 30,000 feet over Honshu in winter, the wind runs west to east at up to 200 miles an hour. Bombers going with it crossed the target at 440 over the ground, far too fast for a Norden bomb sight to solve. Bombers going against it hung over the flak batteries like they were nailed there. Bombs came out of the bay and got picked up and thrown, sometimes miles. Mission after mission, the strike photos came back and the target was still standing. And most days, there were no strike photos worth looking at, because central Japan in winter is under cloud, and the wing got a handful of clear days in 2.5 months. And then there were the fighters. For the first few weeks, the interceptions had been clumsy. Single passes, poor gunnery, pilots who would not close. That changed fast. By January, the Japanese Army Air Force had reorganized its home defense units, brought experienced men in from China and the Philippines, and worked out exactly how to hit a superfortress. Which brings us to the airplane that met them on the 27th, the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki. American intelligence called it Tojo. The Japanese name translates to demon queller, which is a name you give a thing when you want it to frighten people, and in this case it was earned. The Ki-44 was ugly. Short, blunt, a fat radial engine bolted to a fuselage that looked too small for it, wings that were undersized on purpose. Japanese fighter pilots trained on the Ki-43 hated it when it arrived because it would not turn with anything and it landed fast enough to kill you. But it climbed. God, it climbed. A Ki-44-2 could get to 16,000 feet in a little over 4 minutes and keep going. It was not a dogfighter. It was an interceptor, built for one job, and that job was to get up to where the bombers were before the bombers were gone. The armament varied, and the variation mattered a great deal to the men on the receiving end. Some carried 4 12.7mm machine guns. Others carried the HO-301, a 40mm cannon firing caseless ammunition that hit like an artillery shell and had an effective range of about 150 yards, which meant the pilot had to come close enough to count rivets. One hit from it could take a wing off a B-29. The unit that mattered on the 27th of January was the 47th Sentai, flying out of Narimasu, northwest of Tokyo. The 47th had a special detachment inside it, and that detachment is the reason this story exists. They called it the Shinten Sikutai, Air Superiority Unit. What it actually was a ramming squadron. Here is how it worked, and I want to be careful with this because it gets misrepresented constantly. This was not the kamikaze campaign. That came later, it was organized differently, and it involved aircraft loaded with explosives, flown by pilots who were not expected to come back at all. The Shinten pilots were expected to come back. That was the theory anyway. Their aircraft were stripped. Armor plate removed. In some cases, the guns removed entirely, and the ammunition left on the ground. Everything came out that added weight, because weight was altitude, and altitude was everything, and the mission was to climb above a B-29 formation and dive into a bomber. Tail surfaces if you could manage it. A wing route if you could not. The pilot was supposed to hit, then get out. Very few of them got out. The arithmetic behind it was brutal, and, from where Japan sat in January 1945, entirely rational. A B-29 cost more than $500,000 and carried 11 men who had been training for the better part of a year. A stripped KY-44 with a pilot who had 80 hours in type was worth a fraction of that. Trade 1 for 1 all day and you win. Japan could not outproduce American factories or stop the raids with ordinary gunnery, so they stopped trying to be efficient and started trying to be unaffordable. By the end of January, they had brought down or written off at least a dozen superfortresses. Every crew in the 73rd Wing had heard about it. Most had seen the aftermath, which is a fireball at 30,000 feet and then nothing. That was the sky the crew of T-41 flew into. The airplane belonged to the 498th Bombardment Group. T-square was the tail marking, a white square with a black T, and the number was painted on the fin. Somewhere over the Marianas in December, the crew had gotten around to naming her, and after an argument that apparently lasted 3 days, they had settled on Bad Penny. The nose art was a coin with a girl's face on it. The joke, obviously, was that a bad penny always turns up. The aircraft commander was Captain Howard Vance, 28, a former crop duster from Bakersfield who had lied about his flight hours to get into the program, and turned out to be one of the better pilots on the island. Navigator Aaron Feld was a schoolteacher from Rochester who did the fuel math in a leather notebook he would not let anyone else touch. The flight engineer, Tech Sergeant Otto Brandt, was 34, the oldest man aboard, 9 years a Boeing mechanic, and he knew the R335 better than the men who wrote the manual. And in the middle of the airplane, in a little pressurized compartment with a plexiglass blister over his head, sat Staff Sergeant Ray Kovacs of Youngstown, Ohio, 21 years old, Central Fire Control Gunner. You need to understand what that job was, because it was unlike any gunner's position that had existed before. On a B-17, a gunner sat behind his guns and aimed them with his hands and his eyes. On a B-29, the guns were somewhere else entirely. 4 turrets, 2 above and 2 below, each with a pair of 50 caliber Brownings, all of them unmanned. The gunners sat at sighting stations scattered around the airplane, looking through optical sights wired to a General Electric analog computer. You put the reticle on the fighter, dialed in his wingspan, and held it there. The computer added your bomber's speed, the altitude, the air density, the ballistics of the round, and the parallax between where you were sitting and where the guns actually were, and it fired at a point in space where the fighter was going to be rather than where it was. Cams, gears, and Selson motors, correcting continuously. It was the most sophisticated fire control system fitted to any aircraft of the war, and it worked. When it worked. Kovacs sat in the upper station, the barber's chair, under a plexiglass bubble that gave him the whole top half of the sky. He had priority, and he could hand turrets to the other gunners, or take theirs back depending on who had the angle. He was running the airplane's defense as a system, rather than as 5 men shooting at whatever they happened to see. 11 missions. 2 claims, both of them downgraded to damaged by the intelligence officers, which is a thing that happened constantly, and which every gunner in the wing complained about. Kovac had never been credited with a kill. The briefing was at 4 in the morning on the 27th. The target was Nakajima's Musashino plant, on the northwest edge of Tokyo. Target 357. The wing had been after it since November, and had never really heard it. This time the weather ship was reporting broken to clear, which meant visual bombing, which meant they might actually put bombs on the aiming point for once. It also meant the fighters would see them coming from 50 miles out. The intelligence officer stood up and gave them the fighter estimate, and there was a noise in the Quonset hut when he did. Nobody remembers it as a gasp. More of a low sound, men shifting on benches. The estimate was that the Japanese could put up somewhere between 200 and 300 interceptors against this raid. Then he added the part about the ramming unit, and the room went quiet. 76 B-29s took off from the Marianas that morning and spent the next 6 hours over open water doing the thing nobody makes movies about, which is sitting. Kovac said the waiting was worse than the fighting, and that he was not being poetic. He meant it, because in the fighting, you were at least busy. Before I take you into what happened over Honshu, do me one favor. If you are getting something out of this, hit the like button. It genuinely decides whether this story reaches another 10 people or another 100,000, and these men have been forgotten long enough. Subscribe if you have not. Then let's get back to it. They crossed the coast of Honshu a little after noon. The Japanese radar picket line had them well before that. Air raid sirens were already going in Tokyo. At Narimasu and half a dozen other fields, pilots were running. The first fighter Kovac saw was not attacking anybody. One aircraft high, well out to the right, holding a parallel course and making no attempt to close. Everyone knew what it was. A shadower, calling their heading, altitude and speed back to the ground so the interceptors could be vectored straight to a firing position instead of wasting fuel hunting. Vance had the crew check in by station. Then he told them to stop calling out every aircraft they saw, because in 4 minutes there would be too many to call. He was right. They came up in groups, 12 and 16 at a time, and they did not mill around. The first serious pass came at 12:04 from 12 o'clock high, a formation of K-144s that had climbed above the bomber stream and rolled in almost vertically, coming down through the lead squadron nose to nose. That tactic frightened bomber crews more than any other. Closing speed on a head-on pass is about 600 miles an hour, which puts the fighter inside your gunner's envelope for roughly 2 seconds, and it comes from the one direction where a B-29's fire is weakest and there is nothing in front of the pilots but plexiglass. Kovac got the upper forward turret onto the lead aircraft and fired a burst at 800 yards, and then the fighter was through the formation and gone, and he had no idea whether he had hit anything. Nobody did. That is what those passes were like. 2 minutes later he got a real one. A Ki-44 came in from 4 o'clock high, and instead of diving through, the pilot flattened out and tried to hold his gun solution on the bomber to Bad Penny's right. He was pressing. He wanted the kill badly enough to give up his speed advantage for it, and that meant he was in Kovac's sight for 4 seconds instead of 2. Kovac put the reticle on him at 700 yards, dialed the wingspan, and held it. The computer did the rest. 2 turrets, 4 guns, and the tracers did not go where the fighter was. They went where the fighter was going to be, and the Ki-44 flew into them. The starboard wing came apart between the root and the gun bay. The fighter rolled over the top, shed the wing completely, and went down flat, spinning. The right blister gunner, Sergeant Frank Soa, called it out and confirmed it. First one. Nobody said anything else about it. There were about 40 more airplanes in the sky. Over the next 11 minutes, the crew of Bad Penny claimed 2 more. One was a fighter that came up from below and behind, underestimating how far the lower aft turret could depress. The tail gunner, Sergeant Cal Whitmore, saw him coming and simply waited. He fired at 300 yards and hit the cockpit. The KY-44 pushed over and went straight down without any control input at all, which is what an airplane does when the man flying it has stopped flying it. Then they turned onto the bomb run, and everything got worse. The initial point is where a bomb run starts and where a bomber cruise freedom ends. From there to the target, the airplane flies straight and level at constant speed on a constant heading. No jinking, no weaving, no evasion of any kind, because the bombardier has the airplane through the autopilot, and the Norden is solving a problem that a turn would destroy. That meant 4 minutes in a straight line, while several dozen fighters watched them do it. The Japanese knew exactly what the IP meant. They had been studying these formations for 2 months, and when the bombers steadied up, the fighters moved. Kessler called the bomb doors open. The airplane shuddered as the doors came down into the slipstream and the drag hit, and the airspeed bled off, and Bad Penny settled into the run. At 12:19, a formation of KY-44s that had been orbiting above and ahead began to roll in pairs, from 10 and 2 o'clock high. Kovacs took the lead pair. He got the first one at 1,000 yards, held, and fired a long burst that took the fighter's engine apart. It went down trailing a rope of black smoke, and he did not follow it because the wingman was already inside 800 yards and still coming. He shifted, fired, missed, corrected, fired again. Hits along the fuselage. The KI-44 rolled left and dropped away, and Whitmore reported it going down out of control, and that was 4. Then Soa screamed on the intercom. Not called. Screamed. 3 o'clock level. Close. And Kovacs whipped the sight around and saw it, and what he saw was a fighter that had already been hit. It was streaming something, fuel or coolant or both, and it was not firing. Its guns were not firing. He said later he understood in about half a second what he was looking at, and that the half second was the longest one of his life. The pilot was not shooting because the pilot had nothing to shoot with. Kovacs put every gun he had on it. The upper forward turret at that angle brought 450s to bear, and he held the trigger down and walked the fire into the engine, and pieces came off the cowling, and the propeller spinner disintegrated, and the fighter kept coming. That is the detail he could never get past afterward. It kept coming. He was hitting it, and it did not matter, because a dead airplane with speed is still an airplane with speed, and this one had 400 yards of momentum, and no need to survive. It hit the number 3 engine at 12:22. The noise, Brandt said, was like dropping a locomotive on a foundry floor. The KI-44's propeller went through the cowling and into the reduction gearing. The fighter's wing came off against the leading edge. Most of the fuselage went over the top of the bomber and past the tail, and the engine section stayed, jammed into the nacelle, which is where that piece of green-painted cowling was found on Saipan 11 hours later. Bad Penny yawed hard right. The number 3 propeller tore off its shaft and went spinning away, and the crew felt it go, a lurch through the whole airframe. Fire warning on 3. Oil pressure gone on 4, which had taken shrapnel from its neighbor. Vance and Pruitt fought the airplane back level while Brandt hit the fire bottles and shut down both engines on the right side. Kessler dropped the bombs. He was, at that moment, still on the run, and he put them down before anything else. Then Vance rolled out of formation because he had no choice, because a B-29 with both right engines out cannot hold 210 indicated at 30,000 feet, and Bad Penny fell out of the box and started down. And that is when it became a different fight entirely. A bomber inside a formation is protected by every other bomber in it. Overlapping fire, dozens of guns, and a fighter attacking one is attacked by 6. A bomber outside the formation is not a bomber anymore. It is a target that happens to have guns on it. The fighters saw them go. They had been waiting all morning for exactly that. Feld counted somewhere between 14 and 18 coming after them in the first few minutes. Vance put the nose down deliberately, trading altitude for speed, because speed was the only thing holding the airplane up and the only thing making the fighters work for their solutions. They came in relays, and that is worth understanding, because it was not chaos. It was method. 2 or 3 attacked while the rest positioned, then broke off and let the next group come in from a different quarter, and the point was to keep the gunners saturated until a gap opened, against a healthy B-29 that took a while. Against Bad Penny, with the hydraulic pressure dropping and the turrets getting slower every minute, it did not. Kovac got 2 more in that phase, and he could not tell you today how he did either of them. The first came in from 11 o'clock, and he fired at what he estimated as 600 yards, and the fighter's canopy came apart, and it rolled inverted and went down. The second was a beam attack from the left, and the left blister gunner, Sergeant Hollis' beam, opened on it, and Kovac slewed the upper aft turret onto the same target, and between the two of them, the fighter lost its tail. 6. Then the hydraulics went. The turrets went sluggish, then jerky, then the lower forward stopped answering at all. Brandt was in the tunnel pulling breakers and rerouting what he could, and eventually he told Vance flatly that he was out of ideas. At around 13,000 feet, the second one came. Kovac saw it early. It was doing the same thing the first one had done, which is to say it was doing nothing tactical at all. No maneuvering, no firing. It came in from 1 o'clock high with its nose pointed at the flight deck, and it flew as though it were on rails. He fired everything he had left in the forward turret. He hit it, repeatedly, and it did not deviate by a foot. At the last moment, the pilot did something that changed the whole outcome, and to this day, nobody knows if it was intentional. He dropped the nose slightly. Instead of hitting the cockpit, he hit the number 1 engine, the outboard on the left wing. The engine came apart. Shrapnel went through the wing structure and opened the number 1 fuel cell, and aviation gasoline sprayed back into the slipstream in a white sheet. The Ki-44's fuselage broke in half against the leading edge and tore a hole in it you could have put a man through. Bad Penny now had 1 engine. Number 2, the left inboard, a Wright R335. Oh, that had already been running at high power for 3 hours, and now had to keep 30-odd tons of shot-up airplane airborne by itself. They were at 11,000 feet, descending, over water, with the rudder cables damaged, and the wing leaking fuel and a hole in the leading edge, and there were still fighters. 12, by Whitmore's count. What happened over the next 20 minutes is the part of this story that gets the most attention, and it is also the part where I have to be honest with you about what we can and cannot know. Between roughly 12:40 and 1:05 in the afternoon, the crew of Bad Penny claimed 7 more Japanese aircraft destroyed. Kovac accounted for 3 of them from the upper station before the forward turret ran dry. Whitmore, in the tail, claimed 2 more, one of them a fighter that flew through his fire at 200 yards and lost its entire vertical stabilizer. Beam got 1 from the left blister, and 1 went down after taking hits from both blisters at once and was credited to the aircraft rather than to a man. Then the ammunition situation became the whole problem. The upper forward turret was empty. The lower turrets were dead. Whitmore, in the tail, was down to what he estimated as 5 seconds of firing time. Soa, in the right blister, had been hit. He had taken cannon fragments through the right shoulder and upper chest when a burst walked across the rear compartment. He was conscious. He was also unable to lift his right arm, which meant he could not aim his own sighting station, and Kovac came back through to take his position. Picture that crawl. The forward and rear compartments of a B-29 are joined by a padded tunnel 30 inches across and 30 feet long, running over the bomb bays. Bad Penny was unpressurized by then, holed in a dozen places, somewhere around -40 inside, and Kovac went through on his elbows with a walk-around bottle and gloves he could not feel his hands inside of. He got Soa out of the seat, propped him against the bulkhead, and took the station. 2 more fighters came in while he was doing it. He fought them with what was left in the blister guns, hand tracking, no computer, because the fire control system was down and the guns were on manual, which meant the parallax correction was gone, and he was aiming by instinct and 11 missions of experience. He claimed 1. That made 13. And then there was nothing left to shoot with. Every turret dry or dead. Whitmore firing his last belt into empty air to clear his barrels. Beam out. Kovac out. 4 Ki-44s formed up behind them, not attacking, forming up, line astern, about 2 miles back, matching speed, matching altitude, settling in. Kovacs watched them through the blister and knew exactly what he was looking at, because it was the same setup he had seen twice already that day. And this time, there were 4 of them, and he had no bullets at all. Vance could not maneuver. The rudder was jammed. He had bank authority and almost nothing else, and 1 engine, and an airplane that was already flying about 15 knots above the speed at which it would stop flying. The lead fighter accelerated. It came in from dead astern, slightly high, building speed in a shallow dive, and Kovacs said afterward that he could see the yellow spinner and the green camouflage and the red disc on the fuselage side, and that he braced against the frame of the blister and waited, and that the waiting took about 15 seconds and he counted every one of them. Then the fighter's engine let go. Black smoke first, a lot of it, and then the propeller stopped. Just stopped, dead, standing up in the airstream like a signpost. The Nakajima Ha-109 was a good engine that hated being held at full military power, and those pilots had been at combat power for the better part of 40 minutes, climbing, chasing, climbing again. Cylinder head temperatures went past the limits and stayed there. The fighter had probably taken hits earlier too, and the 2 things together finished it. Without power, it could not hold the intercept. It slid below and behind, and Whitmore watched from the tail and reported it going down in a flat glide toward the water, still under some kind of control, but going down. That was the 14th. And yes, this is exactly the claim that got argued about, because no American gunner fired a shot at that airplane. It was written up as a combat loss on the grounds that the engine failure resulted from damage and stress sustained in the attack, and the intelligence officer at Isley Field accepted that reasoning, and the officer who reviewed it a week later did not. The remaining 3 fighters broke off within minutes. Their fuel state left them no choice. A Ki-44 with drop tanks gone, and 40 minutes of combat power behind it, does not have the endurance to chase a crippled bomber out to sea, and they turned back toward the coast and climbed away. The engagement was over. It was about 1:10 in the afternoon, and Bad Penny was 1,500 miles from Saipan, at 10,000 feet, on 1 engine. Feld did the arithmetic in his notebook, and then did it again because he did not believe it the first time. Fuel remaining, best case, was a little under 9 hours. Time to Saipan at the speed they could actually maintain was about 11.5. That is not a margin. That is a gap, and the gap was 2.5 hours wide, and there was nothing in between except the Pacific Ocean. Brandt proposed the thing that saved them, and it was not a clever thing. It was a stupid, desperate thing that happened to work. Number 4 engine had been shut down as a precaution after the first ramming, because oil pressure had dropped. It was damaged. It was not destroyed. Brandt's argument was that if they restarted it and ran it without adequate oil, it would seize, probably inside half an hour. But half an hour of thrust would let them climb a little and trim off some of the drag they were fighting, and the fuel they saved in that half hour might be worth more than the engine. Vance approved it. Number 4 caught, ran rough, and pushed them from 150 knots up to about 170. They got the descent stopped. Then, 26 minutes later, exactly as Brandt had predicted, it seized, and he feathered it, and they were back to 1. After that, it was a matter of throwing the airplane away, piece by piece, to keep it in the air. Everything went out. Gun barrels, ammunition cans, tool kits, radar spares, flak vests, and the auxiliary tank structures out of the bomb bay once they were dry, 400 pounds of dead metal doing nothing. Brandt shut down every electrical system not needed to fly, because every amp drawn was drag on the 1 engine turning the 1 generator, and drag was fuel. The heaters went. The lights went. The inside of the airplane went below -40 and stayed there. Feld raised Iwo Jima at about 3 in the afternoon. The island was still Japanese, and the Marines would not land for another 3 weeks, but American submarines ran lifeguard stations near it, and a crew that ditched close enough had a real chance of being picked up. It was 640 miles away instead of 900. 640 was inside their fuel. Vance turned it down, and his reasoning was cold and correct. Ditching a B-29 in open ocean was survivable about 4 times in 10 with an intact airframe. Bad Penny had a 6-foot hole in her left leading edge, structural damage through both wings, and a jammed rudder. She would not settle onto the water, she would come apart on it. And they had lost one of the 2 life rafts to cannon fire, and one man aboard could not use his right arm. They kept going. Soa died at about 8 in the evening. The wounds had stopped bleeding hours earlier. What killed him was the cold and the blood he had already lost. Kovac had given him his own electrically heated suit liner, the battery-powered kind, and wrapped him in it and stayed beside him for 6 hours in the dark in an unheated aluminum tube at -40. There were morphine syrettes in the first aid kit. They were frozen solid and had been since the coast of Japan. Kovac held them inside his glove against his palm and tried to thaw them and could not. When Soa's breathing stopped, Kovac tried to bring him back and could not do that either. Chest compressions through a heavy flying suit at altitude with hands he could barely close. He worked on him for 4 minutes. Brandt came aft, checked, and told him to stop. They left the body where it was. There was nowhere to take it and no strength to spare for moving it. Number 2 engine ran on. That engine is the other hero of this story. A Wright R335 was rated for continuous maximum power for about 4 hours under ideal conditions. This one did nearly 9, temperatures pegged in the red the whole time, oil pressure swinging between 40 and 60 pounds when the minimum was 50. Brandt kept his hand on the throttle quadrant most of the night, backing off a fraction when the temperature climbed and pushing it up when the airspeed decayed, hour after hour after hour. Around 9 they saw navigation lights off to the east, a Navy destroyer on patrol. It could not help them in any way at all, but it was exactly where Feld's chart said it would be, which told him his position was good, and that mattered more than anyone would have guessed. At 9:45, the fuel gauges read 30 minutes. Distance to Saipan was 120 miles. Time to Saipan was 48 minutes. Brandt transferred everything, every crossfeed valve open, every pump running, every last gallon in every tank routed to the one engine that was still turning, and he told Vance the truth, which was that it would not be enough and that they should be ready to put it in the water short of the island. Feld saw the lights of Isley Field at 2200. They were at 4,000 feet, 8 miles out, and the engine was starting to cough. Fuel starvation surging as the last of it sloshed forward and aft in tanks that were essentially empty. It would run smooth for 20 seconds, cough, catch, run again. The tower cleared them straight in. Crash crews out. Ambulances lined up along the strip. The gear would not come down. No hydraulics. Brandt got on the emergency hand crank and got the nose gear locked and the left main locked, and the right main would not move, jammed by damage nobody could see and nobody could reach. At a mile out and 1,000 feet, number 2 quit for good. The propeller wound down and stopped, and Bad Penny became a 30-ton glider with one wing gear down and a hole in the other wing. Vance flew it. That is really all there is to say. He was too high and too fast, and he had no engine and no rudder and no second attempt available to him, and he put it on the runway anyway, floating past the threshold, touching down long at about 110, with the left wing held up as long as he could hold it. The left main collapsed on contact. The wing came down and hit the coral surface, and the airplane swung left off the runway, and it went through the dirt for 1,500 feet in a wall of sparks and dust before it stopped. 9 men came out of the rear hatch and walked away from it. Kessler had died at his station over Tokyo, hit by a cannon round during the second wave, which the crew had known for hours and had not talked about. Soa was in the rear compartment. Bad Penny herself was struck off charge 2 days later, too badly damaged to be worth repairing, and eventually pushed into the boneyard at the end of the field and picked apart for parts. Now, the count. The initial claim submitted by the crew of T-41 was 14 enemy aircraft destroyed. 14 from one bomber on one mission, which if it stood would be the highest single mission total credited to any bomber crew in the Pacific. It did not entirely stand, and I would be lying to you if I said it did. Gunner overclaiming was universal in that war, and it was not lying. It is what happens when 5 or 6 men watch the same fight from different windows of a machine doing 300 miles an hour while being shot at. 2 men fire at the same fighter. Both watch it go down. Both are certain. Both are honest. And there is still only one airplane. Across the whole bombing campaign, Gunner claims ran somewhere between 2 and 4 times actual enemy losses, and post-war comparison against Japanese records did to this claim what it did to all of them. But here is the thing that survived every review, every downgrade, and every argument, and it is the part that matters. On the 27th of January 1945, 76 B-29s went to Musashino, and the Japanese put up something like 900 separate fighter attacks against them, the heaviest opposition the wing ever faced. 9 bombers did not come back. It was the worst day the 73rd Wing had. And one airplane took 2 deliberate ramming attacks, lost 3 of 4 engines, lost her rudder, lost her hydraulics, lost 2 of her crew, and flew 1,500 miles across the Pacific on a single engine, and put 9 men back on the ground alive. Nobody argues about that part. The wreck was sitting in the dirt beside the runway where anybody could go look at it, and for about a week, everybody on Saipan did. Kovacs was credited officially with 6. He spent the rest of his life declining to argue about the number. In an interview recorded in the 1980s, he was asked directly whether he thought the 14 was real, and his answer was that he did not know and did not much care, and that the only number he ever thought about was 2. Marvin Kessler and Frank Soa. He said he could give you their hometowns, their wives' names, and what each of them had eaten at 4 in the morning before the briefing, and that he had never once in 40 years been able to remember a single thing about any Japanese pilot he shot at, and that this seemed to him like the right way around for a man to be built. Howard Vance went home to California and did not get into an airplane again, not even as a passenger, until 1971. Otto Brandt went back to Boeing. Cal Whitmore, the tail gunner, was 19 years old on the 27th of January 1945, and he lived until 2009. That piece of cowling, the one the ground crew pried out of the No. 1 nacelle with a 2x4, went home in Ray Kovac's footlocker. It sat on a shelf in a garage in Youngstown, Ohio for 51 years. His grandson has it now. He says it still smells faintly of burnt oil when the room gets warm. If this one got to you, do 2 things. Hit like, because that is genuinely what decides whether the algorithm shows this to the next person scrolling past, and these stories are already most of the way to being forgotten without our help. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and whether anyone in your family flew, or waited for someone who did. I read them. There are more of you out there with a photograph of a young man in a leather jacket in a drawer somewhere than you would ever guess, and every time one of you names him here, he stops being a stranger. Thanks for staying with me. See you in the next one. Next.